and welcome to Grand Cayman. I'm Martin Sutton and I've been diving and photographing in these waters for over a dozen years. Beneath this tranquil surface you'll find some of the most spectacular undersea life anywhere, and it's been my pleasure to introduce thousands of divers to this great adventure. Recently we completed an instructional video on the basics of underwater photography using our favorite camera, the Nikonos 5. If you haven't seen this video on the basics, we'd like to recommend that you view it, since it contains a comprehensive look at the equipment, techniques, and subject matter you'll need for a successful underwater photographic expedition. During this program, we're going to explore with you the exciting world of macro photography using extension tubes and close-up photography using the Nikon close-up kit. We'll show you the simple and relatively inexpensive equipment you'll need and how to use it. We'll take you down below and discuss the techniques you should use, and we'll show you some how-to case studies of some of our favorite shots. Finally, we'll give you some great important guidelines to follow for the maintenance of your camera. And we'll tell you about the next program in our Nikonos 5 series, wide-angle photography. As you've seen on the slides we've just shown you, working in macro and close-up can give breathtaking results. Those results come from some factors inherent in macro and close-up photography. The first thing you'll notice about both macro and close-up photography is that, as the names imply, you have to be close up to do them. Both you and your camera will be very close to the subject matter, almost as if you're looking through a magnifying glass. This close proximity to your subject means several things, not the least of which is that by coming so close to your subject matter, you'll have the opportunity to take a closer look at your surroundings. Instead of just getting the big picture of what a reef looks like, you'll be looking at details sometimes a fraction of an inch wide. Some might consider this close, slow scrutiny of all the nooks and crannies to be too time-consuming. We like to think of it as taking time to stop and explore the tiny objects you might not ordinarily see, to stop and smell the roses, if you will. By being just inches from your subject, the problem of suspended particles we discussed in the first tape is virtually non-existent. With your strobe being so close, the subjects are well lighted and the colors super saturated. In addition, because you're shooting with your strobe so close to the subject, your iris is closed down to f22, yielding pictures of astounding clarity. And because of the extremely close strobe, always being your key light source, this kind of photography is good for those murky or overcast days, in water with limited visibility, and for night shoots. But the best part of all is that you'll be surprised to know that these two forms of photography are very easy to learn and are relatively simple to execute. And if you already own a Nikonos 5, the additional equipment necessary is uncomplicated and inexpensive. Before we get into the individual details of both macro and close-up, let's see what each is used for. Close-up photography is for just what the name suggests, taking pictures close up with a close-up kit, with the subject matter being a little less than a foot across depending upon equipment. That's just about the perfect size for things like a colony of plume worms, or fish portraits such as this squirrelfish from Grand Cayman, or this blue-spotted grouper from the Red Sea. Macro photography goes one step further and is used for subjects smaller than 1 or 2 inches across. Things like Christmas tree worms, flamingo tongues, or hermit crabs. The beauty of macro is that you see exquisite detail and textures you would never notice with the naked eye. So let's begin with macro, what many people consider to be the most beautiful form of underwater photography. As we discuss macro photography utilizing extension tubes, several things will become apparent. First, it's the easiest type of underwater photography. Second, all of your settings can be fixed before you leave the house. And third, it's got the greatest sharpness in the details. First, let's take a look at the equipment. As we mentioned, most of the equipment you need you already have with your Nikonos 5 camera and 35mm lens. In order to shoot macro, you'll need an additional macro extension tube and accompanying wireframer. That's it. As far as the strobe system is concerned, even if you only have a small, narrow beam unit, that's sufficient for macro. The macro extension tube moves your lens away from the camera's film plane, effectively allowing the lens to focus closer. The farther away you place the lens from the film plane, the greater the magnification will be. Now, even though some of you will be using a 28mm lens for macro shooting, for the sake of our discussions on this tape, we're going to limit our coverage to the 35mm lens. Most manufacturers only make extension tubes for 35mm lenses, so they are the most common. In the event that you are using a 28mm, make sure you use the extension tube for the 28mm. Otherwise, all other macro principles remain the same. That being said, we'd next like to mention that your macro system has a second element, the wireframer, designed especially for a particular size extension tube. Remember, your Nikonos 5 is not a single lens reflex camera, so this framer tells you how to line up the shot and what your focal point is going to be. Extension tubes generally come in 4 different sizes, each serving a specific purpose and each with their own characteristics and specific wireframer. With most manufacturers, these wireframers are numbered to match the type of tube you are using, or some are color-coded. Just be sure you're using the corresponding wireframer for the extension tube you choose. The 4 types of macro extension tubes commonly used are 1:3, 1:2, 1:1, and 2:1. These numeric labels are called reproduction ratios and describe the effect these tubes have on what your lens sees. For example, in a 1:3 extension tube, the first number in the ratio describes the picture size, or 1. The second number, 3, describes the real-life size. In other words, if the image on the slide is 1 inch, the real-life size was 3 inches. Another way of putting it would be to say that the finished slide image represents 1/3 the life-size image. When using a 1:2 extension tube, the image will be half the size as real life, and when using a 1:1 extension tube, the image size and the real life size are the same. If you use a 2:1 extension tube, your image size will be twice the size of the real life subject. There are longer tubes available, but they are of little use and seldom used. You've also probably noticed that the 1:3 extension tube is the thinnest, has the framer farthest away from the camera with the biggest frame area. Whereas the 1:1 extension tube is longer, with a smaller framer closer to the lens. The 2:1 extension tube is the longest and has a tiny frame area very close to the lens. As you might have expected, each of these extension tubes has its own specific depth of field characteristics. The concept of depth of field causes some people difficulty, and if you're one of those, we have a fairly comprehensive discussion on our first tape. But for now, let's say depth of field is the range of focus both in front of and behind the subject at any given f-stop. We'll be using f/22 for both macro and close-up, and we'll always use the edge of the frame for focusing. As for our extension tubes at f/22, the 1:3 extension tube has a depth of field of 1¼ inches. The 1:2 extension tube has a depth of field of 3/4 inch. The 1:1 extension tube has a depth of field of 1/4 inch. And the 2:1 extension tube has a depth of field of only 1/8 inch. As you might imagine, the 1:3 extension tube is the easiest to use, whereas the 2:1 extension tube requires more precision due to the extremely narrow depth of field, and is therefore much more difficult to use. In my files I have perhaps 5,000 slides, of which maybe 3,000 are macro. Out of the 3,000, perhaps 25 are 2:1. 2:1 macro just isn't that easy to shoot, and the subjects are hard to find. One of the best things about macro photography is not only that the equipment is so easy to use, but it can all be prepared prior to getting on your dive boat. Knowing that your settings are pre-established, it's just a matter of double checking them on the boat or on the bottom before you begin to shoot. The first thing you want to do before you leave for your dive is to choose the type of film you want to use and load your camera. In the first tape in this series, we recommended you use a relatively low-speed reversal or slide film for best results. We like to use the spectacular new Fuji Velvia 50. You may want to review the earlier tape for proper loading procedures. After you load the film, be sure to double check that you've set the ASA ISO indicator dial accordingly to assure proper exposures. The next important decision you have to make is to choose which macro extension tube you want to use on the dive. For our example, we're going to use the 1:2 extension tube and wireframer. Again, this will reduce real-life objects to 1/2 their real size on the film. One of the few disadvantages of macro photography we haven't discussed is that once you've chosen which extension tube to use, you can't change it underwater. Each dive is dedicated to that special type and size of subject matter suitable for the extension tube you have chosen. After you select the extension tube, you'll want to remove the 35mm from your Nikonos 5. Next, check the O-rings and make sure they are properly lubricated and don't contain any cracks, and the O-ring groove to make sure that it doesn't have any debris. Take care not to over-lubricate the O-rings. Then attach the 35mm lens to the extension tube in the same way you would attach it to the camera. Again, check the markings or the color code on your wireframer. Attach the extension tube to the camera body so that the threaded screw hole on the tube is on the bottom. Make sure the lens is properly aligned. Then attach the wireframer to the extension tube you have chosen, in this case the 1:2. You also want to make sure the bottom of the wireframer is parallel to the bottom of the camera. Once you've mounted the wireframer, look down over the camera to get a feel for what it will look like underwater. Again, use the outside of the wireframer. Next, be sure to turn your camera mode selector to the A, or aperture priority position. If you don't fully understand why we're setting the camera mode to aperture priority, again, we recommend you view the first instructional tape in this series. Since your strobe will be so close, and we want the greatest depth of field, you need to preset the iris to f/22. We should reiterate that even with your strobe very close to your subject and your iris at f/22, you have an extremely narrow depth of field that can be measured in fractions of an inch, no matter which extension tube you use. You should preset your distance for the closest setting, or 2.75 feet on the 35mm lens. Now you're ready to aim your strobe. Unlike regular underwater photography, where you want to light from the side to avoid lighting the suspended particles and getting pictures with backscatter, for macro photography we generally aim the strobe directly at the subject, or where the subject will be, from over the top of the camera. This eliminates shadows cast by the strobe light hitting the framer. To eliminate this problem, some manufacturers offer framers whose posts can be removed when necessary. This is also a useful feature when trying to shoot a subject in a tight corner, or one of those that would be spooked by the framer posts. In a few minutes, we'll show you some variations on aiming the strobe directly at the frame from the top. But for now, this type of mounting means turning the strobe elbow inside and aiming the head towards the center of the framer. The angle of coverage of your strobe, even if it is a small one, will be sufficient to cover the entire area described by your wireframer. Your strobe has now become the sole key light, which makes this kind of photography perfect for those overcast days, night dives, or when there is low visibility in the water due to lots of suspended particles. Two other things to remember about your strobe when shooting: be sure it's in the TTL mode, and bring plenty of fresh batteries on your trip. So, with your distance preset at the closest setting, and your iris preset to f22, your camera mode preset to A, and your strobe aimed over the camera at the center of the framer, you're all ready for your dive. Until you get on the boat, you may wish to remove the strobe arm and the wire framer, since it sticks out and is clumsy and might become twisted or bent. If you remove the wire framer, be sure to install the matching one when you arrive and unpack on the boat. Once you've arrived on the boat and you've unpacked your gear, you'll want to check your camera settings again. The first few times you do this, you may want to bring along your own waterproof list. After the first few dives, the checklist will become almost automatic. Make sure your wire framer matches your extension tube. Attach your wire frame, set your iris to f22, the focus to the closest setting, 2.75 feet, your camera mode to A, or aperture priority, and the strobe to TTL. And finally, aim your strobe. It's critically important that you don't get so excited about the beautiful macro pictures you're about to take that you forget your standard diving safety procedures. So be absolutely certain that you have followed all of the safety precautions and have paid close attention to the dive master's briefing. Now, with everything you need on your camera preset, and you've adequately prepared for a safe dive, you're ready. While you're still at the bottom of the anchor line, find a patch of sand where you can settle down and look at your camera one more time to see if the presets have moved. In theory at least, what makes macro photography so much easier than other types is the fact that these fixed settings never need to be changed on your dive. Since you're going in tighter for a closer examination of the reef and all it has to offer, you may want to take a moment to reflect on the fragile environment where you are just a temporary visitor. Everything you come near has the potential of being irrevocably damaged just by your proximity. It's extremely important that you be aware of the environmental consequences of your visit. When shooting a macro picture, you must be extremely still, being careful where you hold on for support. Avoid pedaling furiously, creating fin weight with your fins, or bobbing and weaving. This is not a boxing match, and you mustn't jeopardize the reef or its inhabitants just for the sake of a shot. This technique is referred to as photo buoyancy control, and separates good photographers from reef wreckers. The Nikonos 5 macro and close-up systems are designed to be used with one hand. This leaves your free hand, or better yet just one finger, to help you stabilize in a dead portion of the reef to minimize damage. Keep your knees, fins, and hardware away from the reef. Your ideal subject matter with the 1 to 2 extension tube will be approximately 1 to 2 inches in height. You may want to look for something static rather than a moving fish. Nudibranchs, small marine snails, make excellent beginning subjects, as do flamingo tongs and colorful soft corals. Peer over the top of the camera, down through the wire frame to your subject. In macro or close-up, you can't use the viewfinder because it no longer has any relevance, because the focusing elements have been distorted. Remember, use the framer to frame or compose your shot. Position your subject in the center of the wire framer, even with the wire edge, without touching the subject. Again, the delicate beauty that catches your eye and inspires your creativity most likely means that the subject is extremely fragile. Align the edge of the frame with the point on your subject matter that you want in focus. Sometimes this is not an easy decision and is best left up to your aesthetic judgment. But like most questions of composition, it's all subjective, and it's these aesthetic judgments that separate the serious artist from the weekend snap shooter. Here are some other tips to help you get started. Try to pick the subject which best fit into the macro format that you've chosen. One of the most common mistakes in macro photography is choosing inappropriate subject matter. Remember, you're not there to shoot anything that moves. You're specializing in 1 to 2 macro on this dive. If some once-in-a-lifetime shot were to come along that didn't suit itself to the chosen extension tube, you might have to compromise on your composition just to get the shot. Try to get a complete image into your frame, without cropping tops, bottoms, or sides from the subject matter. Make sure your foreground and background don't contain any distracting elements. There are some subjects which have special features that you might want to highlight by moving your strobe. No matter which direction you choose to aim the strobe from, you should remember to keep it at the same distance as if it were mounted in its normal position. Some photographers choose to move their strobe to the top for top lighting. This can be a dramatic effect as seen in this purple sea fan, where the top lighting enabled the camera to create a different mood from that which normal lighting could have given. Some choose to light from behind, an aesthetic effect known as backlighting. Backlighting often provides a new perspective on a subject, revealing fine details ordinarily overlooked. Note the lace-like nature of this sea fan when backlit. When backlighting, you must be careful not to aim the strobe directly into the camera lens, or you'll get flare or a harvest moon look in your pictures. Side lighting is sometimes used, but you have to be careful that your wireframer doesn't cast a shadow on your subject. To alleviate this problem, some manufacturers produce framers with removable posts, as we've already seen. Without this facility available to them, some photographers even go to the extreme of sawing off one of the frame uprights. On your first macro dive, you may wish to shoot some easy subjects and work towards more difficult subjects on subsequent dives. Here are several good macro subjects that you'll find in Caribbean waters. This colorful flamingo tongue is a relatively common, slow-moving snail and therefore easy to shoot. But you have to be careful because if disturbed, it pulls back its spotted mantle. It requires that you settle down, get steady, and gently place the framer around the subject so as not to disturb the animal. These Christmas tree worms also require patience, for they live in holes that they drill in the coral. When disturbed, they retreat back into their homes, and their brilliant twin-gill plumes disappear. But if you set up your wireframer right outside the hole and wait patiently for 2, 3, or 4 minutes, your waiting will be rewarded with the most spectacular display. If the Christmas tree worm is frightened back in a second time, it's unlikely that it will come out for quite a while. Hermit crabs disappear into their shells when you approach. If you carefully pick it up and place it over on its back, compose the shot with your wireframer and wait patiently, it'll slowly emerge, allowing you to shoot a series of beautiful frames of this interesting creature. The fire coral is a hard coral with tiny little stinging hairs called pneumatocysts. If you were to light it from the front, the results would be flat and fairly boring. But when you backlight the subject, allowing the foreground to go to silhouette and the strobe light to pick up the fine detail of the pneumatocysts, the fire coral becomes a dynamic subject. Night dives are the perfect time to use your preset macro equipment, for at night the reef comes alive. But before beginning, there are some special considerations that you should be aware of if this is your first photo night dive. The Nikon SB102 has a built-in light called a target light. Though not strong enough to act as a sole night light, it allows you to be sure that your strobe is always aimed correctly. If your strobe doesn't have such a light built in, you can attach an aiming or modeling light. Some manufacturers produce brackets for attaching them. These attached lights will give you a free hand and still allow you to see where your strobe is aimed. It's a good idea to carry a spare flashlight in your pocket, not dangling from your wrist or BC clip where it will come into contact with the coral. Many of the fish which swim freely in the daytime seek protection within the reef as the night draws in. Predators, seldom seen in daytime hours, start to prowl, such as this huge crab or this lobster. Fish, startled by the diver's lights, stumble around as if in a daze. The photographer finds many perfect subjects in the darkness. The wreck of the Balboa is known as one of the finest night dives anywhere. Be sure to include a night dive for macro on your next dive itinerary. Now that we've had a look at macro photography, let's move on to close-up. Close-up photography is very similar to macro with just a few exceptions. But again, you'll find it very easy to learn and execute. The thing I like best about it is that it makes you slow down and enjoy some of the beauty you might otherwise have missed. During our macro shooting, we moved the 35mm lens away from the body of the camera. But for close-up photography, we're going to keep the lens on the body and attach a diopter or secondary optic on the front of the lens. The diopter is analogous to looking through a magnifying glass. The Nikonos close-up kit is relatively inexpensive and enables you to fill up your frame with objects slightly larger than those we've been looking at in macro. The Nikon close-up kit comes in 6 pieces and a specially designed travel case. Inside you'll find a close-up lens, a lens support rod that acts as a mounting bracket on your accessory shoe, a detachable framer support rod, and 3 wire framers, each specific to the lens you are using. Notice that the framer area is larger than on macro, and it'll be placed farther away from the lens. Your wire frame kit can be used with a 28mm, the 35mm or the 80mm lens. This time we're again going to use the 35mm lens because it's the one that most underwater photographers already own. When you use the 35mm lens, your reproduction ratio is 1 to 4.5, which means an object 4.5 inches wide will reproduce 1 inch wide on the slide. As you assemble your close-up system for the first time, You'll begin by attaching the lens support rod to the accessory shoe located on top of the camera. Then mount the close-up lens on the camera. To do this, you have to loosen the knob on the side of the mount. Lay the camera on its back and insert the lens into the support mechanism and down over the face of the lens. Don't use force while doing this, rather coax it into place by wiggling it on gently. Tighten the white knurled knob on the lens support bracket finger tight. If you own a Nikonos 1, 2 or 3, you'll have to take out the white knurled knob and use the lower opening. Then tighten the locking screw that enables the close-up kit to grip the lens. You'll notice that the close-up diopter has slots in the top and bottom, which we've highlighted for you to see more easily. Once submerged, these slots allow water to fill the area between the 35mm lens and the diopter. In a few minutes, we'll show you how to clear any remaining air bubbles from between the two lenses. With the camera face up, attach the support rod for the framer and tighten the locking screw. The framer support rod will hold the wire framer 9 1/4 inches from the lens. Finally, attach the appropriate wire framer to the support rods. Double check to see that the wireframe indicator matches the lens you're using, in our case the 35mm framer. Next, preset the focus distance on your lens to infinity. This is the exact opposite of what you did on macro. Preset your iris to f22, your camera mode to A, or aperture priority. Your depth of field at f22 with the 35mm diopter will be 3 inches. Use the wire posts as your focus plane. Load your camera and set the ISO ASA dial. And after you mount your strobe assembly, aim your strobe at the center of the wire framer. This procedure is similar to the one you use during macro photography. When you shoot, your strobe will be set to the TTL setting, but for now keep it in the off position to save batteries. With everything preset, you're now ready to shoot. You should pick up the camera and get a feel for what the attachments look and feel like. Again, you'll be using the wire framer for aiming and composition. Now that you know how to assemble a Nikonos close-up kit, you can take it apart, put it in the travel case, and reassemble it once you're on the boat. The extra cavity in the travel case is designed to hold the Nikonos 5 camera should you wish. Just before you leave the boat, go over your presets on the camera once again. At the bottom of the anchor line, go through the presets on your camera one more time. The mode select is set to A, or aperture priority. The ASA selector to the correct film speed. Focus on infinity, and f-stop set to f22. Check to see no bubbles are adhering to the lens, and if they are, shake the system gently to dislodge them. Set the strobe to TTL, and make sure it's turned on and the ready light is glowing. As you search the reef for subject matter, you'll find that the easiest way to start out is with static subjects, such as this yellow tube sponge. Your depth of field is just over 3 inches, so you still need to be careful that the most important element of the subject lies in the main plane of focus. Perfect buoyancy control will enable you to hover and take superb pictures without coming into contact with the living reef. As you become more adept with the close-up kit, you move on in degree of difficulty. It's a good idea to teach yourself the approximate size of the wireframer on your close-up kit, because occasionally you'll encounter a subject that might be nestled in the reef and inaccessible with the cumbersome framer. If this should occur, remove the framer and use the remaining support rod to help you focus. With your close-up kit attached, you should be concentrating on subjects that fit within the framer. But should you come across one of those once-in-a-lifetime subjects that's larger than your framer, you can remove the close-up lens while you're underwater. This ability to change formats underwater is one of the primary advantages of close-up over macro. You want to be sure to return to all the proper close-up settings before you start shooting your close-ups again. If you're shooting a fish, try to wait until it's facing you rather than swimming away. This may sound like a rather obvious suggestion, but it does require some patience and maybe even a bit of fish food. Use the eye of your fish as your focal point. Here in Grand Cayman, many of the dive sites have resident fish that will happily cooperate. Scorpionfish make excellent subjects with the detail of their colorful bodies and their tendency to stay still. Black-barred soldierfish with parasitic isopods on their head provide a bizarre subject for close-up. And the extraordinary shape of the seahorse is perfectly recorded in this format. For those with the eye to look and the patience to wait, the reef is alive with photographic opportunities for macro and close-up. The tiny creatures of the reef, whether captured in macro or close-up, present an exciting challenge for the underwater photographer. In addition, you'll dazzle your audience with fine detail and intense color, and they'll never know how easy it really was. So now you know how to use this simple equipment to get beautiful results. We encourage you to come and down to Fisheye and try it. Until next time, I'm Martin Sutton in Cayman, wishing you great shooting. Don't go away. Coming up next is a special bonus section on camera maintenance and a look at the next tape in our instructional series, Advanced Underwater Photography with the Nikonos 5, Wide Angle. So far in our Nikonos 5 series, we've gone over basic camera techniques in our first tape, and in our second tape explored the advanced techniques of macro and close-up. But in order to be sure that you continue to take full advantage of your new skills, you need to be sure that you follow a regular program of maintenance for your Nikonos 5. So for the next few minutes, we want to discuss some maintenance techniques which you should follow to prevent problems. Care and maintenance of your camera system begins before the dive and extends afterwards. We've already covered how to set up the camera system in our first tape, so we'll now concentrate on the attention the camera system needs after you've gotten out of the water. Many dive boats these days are equipped with freshwater rinse tanks. If your boat has such a tank, then begin by immersing the system and allowing it to soak. This will prevent salt from drying on the system. If your dive boat doesn't have a rinse-off tank, you may want to consider bringing your own bucket and water. It's not normally advisable to work on your system on the boat, but if you need to open the camera, say to change film, then there are a few steps to follow. Firstly, change out of your wetsuit or skin, towel off and cover up with something dry. Be sure to dry your hair. Many drops of water have fallen into cameras from wet heads. Next, check to see if there's a dry area aboard out of the sun where you can work without having to dodge spray. Then, towel dry the camera system. You'll probably find it easier if you first disassemble the strobe and viewfinder from the camera tray. Now, unwind the film. And open the back of the camera with the lens facing upwards. The film will fall out into your hands, and gravity will ensure that no water drips into the camera. If you need to change batteries on the SB103 Speedlight, again remember gravity. Unscrew the battery compartment cap so that any water droplets will fall away from the battery compartment. If water does get in here, it can seep right into the strobe, leading to a hefty repair bill. Tap the cap against your hand. This will displace the water trapped in the cap and ensure that it won't get into the battery compartment when you reassemble the strobe. When you return from your day of diving, again give your system a soaking. Assuming that you have no film in the camera, you can work the controls of the system, so displacing salt from nooks and crannies. Dry off the system completely and disassemble it. Many people leave the cables connected to both strobe and camera throughout a week-long dive trip. This chances that the screw threads will freeze in place with the buildup of salt. In this situation, it's almost impossible to break open the threads without causing costly damage. It's much better to disconnect the cables each evening and remove the O-rings. Check the O-rings as we showed you in the first tape, and apply a very light helping of O-ring grease only if necessary. Check to make sure there's no moisture in the flash port of the camera. You shouldn't apply O-ring grease to the cable end or flash port, or you may risk the strobe not firing due to the buildup of grease on the pins. Check the O-ring on the camera back, and again re-lubricate only if necessary. You can check the battery by advancing the frame counter to frame 1. Then, with the lens wide open, depress the trigger slightly to activate the LEDs. As you aim from light to dark, the LEDs should change inside the viewfinder. If you don't see the LEDs, change the batteries and try again. The easiest way to check the batteries in the strobe is with a battery tester. These are relatively cheap and available at electronics stores, but if you don't have one, you'll know to change the batteries when the ready light starts to take longer and longer to come back on after a shot. Markings on the battery holder indicate correct polarity, and the clip can only fit into the strobe one way. It's advisable to load your camera the night before the trip. At the end of your trip, remove the O-rings so they don't get compressed in storage. If you have a spare set, you can keep one just for storage, so the equipment will maintain its waterproof integrity.
Thank you. Come on over here, we'll get you out of the water, help you get out. Well, how was your dive?
Oh gosh, it was just great.
Good, good.
But that camera doesn't seem to be working.
Oh, really? Oh no, it's flooded, flooded, flooded.
Seriously though, one of the most unfortunate things that can happen to you as an underwater photographer is that your system floods. There are a few steps, however, that you can take that will limit that damage. The worst thing that can happen to an underwater photographer is to suffer a flood. The first reaction is to cut your throat, but with the right approach you may be able to limit the damage or even save the camera completely. The first reaction many photographers have when faced with a flood is to immediately immerse the camera opened wide into fresh water. Well, that's not necessarily the best approach. The first step is to turn the electricity off in the system, and that means taking the batteries out. If you notice a flood while underwater, immediately turn your mode selector to R or M90 to turn off the battery power. Next, take out the film. If you are able to rewind the film, it may be salvageable, but if left in, the emulsion will start to seep into the innards of your camera, creating a real mess. Next, try to identify where the flood occurred and which parts of the camera are affected. Many times a flooded camera may not have flooded the lens, and putting the lens into water too just adds to your repair bill. In this case, the back of the camera has some water in it, but the front of the camera is dry. Open the lens to its widest aperture and check if there's any water in it. In this case, there isn't. This appears to be a very minor flood, with only a little water having made its way into the back of the camera. So our photographer towels the camera dry and will then send it out for repair without the lens. Even though the problem was minor, it's still a good idea to have the camera checked, as water could have penetrated the inside workings of the camera. In more severe cases, wash out the salt water and send the camera, still damp, as soon as possible to an authorized repair facility. A little bit of conscientious maintenance can go a long way towards ensuring that your next underwater photo expedition will be a successful one. If you've enjoyed this tape on macro and close-up, you'll want to be sure to see the next tape in the series, Advanced Underwater Photography, Wide Angle. You'll see why wide-angle photography can be the most challenging yet most artistic of all types of underwater photography. You'll learn elements of composition, forced perspective to make those special wide-angle shots that catch your viewer's eye, how to shoot underwater portraits, how to shoot distant diver shots, how to shoot silhouettes, and close focus wide-angle. We conclude this advanced wide-angle course with a special section on how to direct underwater models. So I'll see you next time on Advanced Underwater Photography Wide Angle for more helpful advice on how to make your underwater shots prize winners. I'm Martin Sutton. To order your copies of Basic Underwater Photography with the Nikonos 5 and Advanced Underwater Photography Wide Angle, call, write or fax to Fisheye, P.O. Box 30076, Grand Cayman, British West Indies. Telephone 1-809-947-4209 and fax 1-809-947-4208. The basic tape costs just $24.95 plus $3.95 shipping and handling. The advanced tapes cost $29.95 plus $3.95 shipping and handling. For orders outside the United States, shipping is $15. PAL versions of our tapes are available for an additional $15. Send check, money order, or credit card information and order your tapes today. They just may be your best photographic tool.